Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just to remind everyone, this is a threat intelligence briefing related to Russian cyber activity against critical infrastructure. One of the things that I will just point out at this point in time is that what we're going to cover this afternoon is not related to anything to do with the electoral process or the elections that you may have heard about in the media recently and the activity related to that. This is a different set of activity that's been attributed to Russia. And so we'll dive into kind of what that activity specifically is and the reason that that activity and being aware of it is critical to those of you who are involved in the critical infrastructure sector. There are 16 sectors as defined by the Department of Homeland Security. And so many of you here represent one or more of those sectors. Before we get into the actual threat intelligence briefing, I do want to give you a little bit of background on Sensato and our partner Comply Assistant. We're both jointly putting this together and hosting this event. We will give opportunity for question and answer at the end of the presentation. And so we do welcome your interaction and feedback. So with that, let's go ahead and get started in terms of a little bit about us. So we started in 2013, specifically focused on healthcare and critical system cybersecurity. We've continually evolved the company since then. We're located in New Jersey, just outside of Red Bank. We have a variety of different services we offer, but there are basically three primary lines of business that we focus on. First, we have a security operations center that helps monitor and look for threats on our client networks. We have a medical device security program specifically focused on medical device cybersecurity. And we also have a cybersecurity operations platform known as Nightingale. Our partner, Comply Assistant, is basically a top-rated enterprise governance, risk, and compliance management platform. They work very closely with us. They also have a very strong vendor risk management solution as a service. And they most recently brought to market a mobile app that allows you to do HIPAA privacy and security walkthroughs. So between the combination of the two organizations, we have a very strong depth in terms of cybersecurity and risk and privacy management when it's related to critical infrastructure, healthcare, and the related sectors. Before we dive into this, I just want to give you some quick heads up of some events that we're going to be doing over the next couple of months or so. First one is we'll be introducing our Nightingale product in a technical preview on August 15th. If you'd like to attend that, learn more about what we're doing there, please send an email to info@sensato.co. We also, on August 23rd, will be jointly working with Comply Assistant to do a presentation on medical device cybersecurity. And again, you can reserve a seat for that at info@sensato.co. It'll be a virtual presentation. And then we're hosting the Sensato Cybersecurity Leadership Summit here in Red Bank on October 25th. And that is a one-day workshop where you'll be working with colleagues to kind of think about cybersecurity strategies. It's a very different type of event. If you'd like to attend that or get further details, please email info@sensato.co. So with that, I want to shift things into kind of getting into the meat of this presentation. And first and foremost, though, before we dive into the actual intelligence information, do need to give everybody a heads up that the information that we provide here is as is. We do encourage you and strongly suggest that before you make any decisions based on this information, you do your own diligence and your own research and then adjust what you learn specifically for your environment. So the information here is also freely shareable. There's nothing here that we're going to present that's classified. Much of this information comes to us from either Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, or research that we've done independently to confirm and further along the intelligence that we're providing to you. So with that, I just want to give you a brief insight into our intelligence threat evaluation cycle. So we do a lot of threat analysis here as part of our Security Operations Center. We gather intelligence from throughout the world. We then process that intelligence. We go into an analysis and production phase. We validate what we learn, and then we go ahead and disseminate it through threat intelligence briefings, much like this, or written documentation, or other more intimate exchanges of information one-on-one with different clients. But overall, the takeaway here is that we do a good amount of work to really qualify what we're telling you. So that's kind of the preamble and the housekeeping stuff out of the way. And what I'd like to do is kind of start by giving you a snapshot of what we're specifically talking about here. So the information related to this briefing involves the Russian government. And we won't be getting into the specifics around attribution. I can tell you that the attribution has been done by the Department of Homeland Security and FBI, and would recommend that you turn to those sources to further validate how they know that this was an operation that was carried on by Russia and is an ongoing operation. Now, one of the things that is important to understand is that this, and we'll get very deep into every one of these things, so I'm going to explain to you exactly how this was done as we get through this presentation. But this campaign, this attack, or this mission, is a multi-stage intrusion, and I'll explain more of what I mean by that in a few moments. But it's a very important thing to keep in mind is, and really the crux here, the reason that this is such a significant challenge for a lot of organizations is because it is a multi-stage intrusion. The other thing to keep in mind is that the actors, when they did this, and when I say the actors, I'm referencing the Russian attackers, they did stage malware, they used spear phishing and some other techniques to gain access. They then went on and did what we considered traditional exploitation of a target once they gained access. We'll talk again much more detail on this. I just want to kind of give you the high-level snapshot and set a foundation for everybody. This is considered an advanced persistent threat, meaning that these attackers were in this for the long term. In some cases, they stayed in the network for a period of 18 months before they exfiltrated and left the network. There are hundreds of victims. I think this is something that was eye-opening to us here at Sensato and Comply Assistant, was that we're not just talking about a handful of targets here. These were hundreds of targets that fell victim to this campaign, and those targets include things like U.S. government entities, energy or power grid organizations, nuclear commercial facilities, water, aviation, critical manufacturing. So this was a very targeted critical infrastructure attack. The one thing that is probably extremely eye-opening in terms of this attack, and so we classify this as traditional intelligence gathering operation, is that the attack was, as best we can tell in all sources, basically state that there was nothing here that was done to physically impact the infrastructure. So for example, they didn't shut off power grids or disrupt nuclear operations or aviation. They simply gathered information. Now, several weeks ago, we reported on a threat called Orange Worm. You can reference the URLs you can visit our website, visit our YouTube channel. We have recordings of that threat intelligence briefing, which is very similar. And that's where healthcare came under attack, the healthcare sector, through medical devices. And again, the only thing that was done in that situation was information was just gathered. There was no exploit of systems. There was no stealing of personal health information or financial data. Basically, the attackers only inventoried the environment. And that's very similar to what we saw happen here. It was just an inventory of the environment, if you will. Now, obviously, there's an extreme amount of intelligence value for traditional kinetic type operations based on this type of operation. You now have a fingerprint for critical infrastructure sector, and that can be used for a variety of different operations in the future. But the important thing here is to keep in mind that hundreds of victims across critical infrastructure, and that basically this was an intelligence gathering event. The attacks do go back as far as March 2016. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And there were a variety of different techniques they used. And rather than get into them here, I'm going to take you through exactly what those techniques were and how they evolved. I think one thing that I will tell you up front, which is kind of a spoiler alert, but I also think will intrigue those of you that kind of have a technical slant to this briefing or have a technical background in attending this briefing, is that the attackers in this situation did not exploit any vulnerabilities. And what I mean by that is typically when we see attackers come after a target, they will exploit some type of vulnerability, meaning that the attacker will find some misconfigured SSL, or they'll find some type of, they'll deploy a virus or something of that nature. In this situation, in these attacks, that was not the case. For the most part, everything we see them do, and what you'll see in this presentation, is that they used standard technology to enable their ability to penetrate systems. And that's a very dangerous situation, because when you're just using the standard mechanical operation, the standard technology that everybody uses every day, it becomes very hard to defend against that. And so one of the things that you'll see as a constant theme through this threat intelligence briefing is that we're going to return to that, because I think it's really important that you walk away understanding that this was not something where someone wrote a zero-day exploit or there was a vulnerability that they found and were able to break in. The reason I believe that the numbers are so high in terms of the victims is because these attackers were very crafty at just using standard technical functionality to enable their capabilities or their objectives. So with that, we're going to dive in another layer deeper into this, and we're going to talk a little bit about this multi-stage capability. Now, you'll have to forgive me if I take some poetic license as we go through this, but I kind of find this to be, of all the attacks that I've looked at in the past few years, this one is extremely, to me, kind of an exciting attack. It's very well thought out. It's extremely well funded. The resources at hand were ample. And the way that they actually carried this out was in many ways admirable. And in some cases, I get people say, how could you admire what they do? The reality is that we need to truly and deeply understand our adversaries if we're going to defend against them. So with that, let's talk a little about the playing field that they put in place. This staging target, this black icon, represents basically vendors of the intended target. So for example, in healthcare, that would be your business associates. In the power sector, that may be organizations that help you manage your infrastructure or provide security services. Now, the one thing I want to be very clear about and very careful about is that in none of this, when we use the word vendor, please do not make the mistake that when I say vendor, I mean a technical vendor. In many of the cases, in many of these situations, these were just vendors. It could be the people that are providing janitorial services. It could be the company that's providing landscaping. It could be the company that is providing technical services. So please apply the broadest possible definition to the word vendor as you kind of go through this, because it's very important to keep that in mind. This red graphic represents the actual intended target. So the combination of the staging target and the intended target are really what we mean by a multi-stage attack. Another way to think of this is a supply chain attack, which we've heard about in the past, but probably not to this level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through kind of how this played out, and then give you kind of, we'll dive into the actual attacks once we get through this kind of animation of how these things worked. So the first thing we have is this one vendor, and this one's very important. It's kind of a lone vendor that was, we believe, to be compromised about 16 months from when the attack started. So this guy stayed dormant. The attackers got into it and didn't do anything. They didn't do anything for quite some time, possibly over a year. They just infiltrated the target, and that's all they did. Given this is a black icon, you should know that this is a vendor of somebody that services organizations in the critical infrastructure sector. What that vendor does is not important. It's just important to understand that it's a vendor. And once that was done, the attackers then went after several other vendors, and they were able to target them very specifically. And I think that's a second takeaway. And we'll see more of this when we get into the actual tactics that were used here. And that is that these attackers were very specific about who they went after and how they did this. So the important thing to keep in mind is that once they got to these vendors, these partners, these staging targets, if you will, they then identified a government agency. And we're not going to name who that government agency is, but they started to play with the fact that they were able to send phishing emails to not only this government agency, but to some of the other vendors. And once they were able to do that, they were able to pivot from one vendor to another. So we have this situation here where one vendor was supporting another vendor, which was supporting the critical infrastructure sector. Now that eventually led to even more identified targets. And again, these are very specifically identified targets. This was not a broad sweeping phishing campaign or just kind of throwing things out and seeing who would respond. There was a lot of time and energy put into specifically who the targets were that they were going to go after. And then several more targets were identified. Now at that point, these guys started to send more and more phishing emails, and we'll examine what these phishing emails were in a moment. But that also led to the identification of MSPs, which are technical infrastructure. These are technology companies that support these targets, right? They could be outsourced operations, they could be outsourced IT, but this is an IT organization. There were several of these that were targeted. So these also became part of the recon efforts. So once the phishing emails were sent out and they found that there was some interest in some things happening here, the next thing that occurred was there was a reconnaissance done. Once the reconnaissance was done, they then went back to this original vendor, this original vector, if you will, that I said was was the first one that was compromised almost over a year ago, and they used that to then actually create the access into the intended targets. And as you can see, one of the targets that they actually accessed was this this managed solution provider, this MSP. And so it's really important to kind of just keep in mind the sophistication level here. And one of the things that when I talk to organizations or board of directors that I often mention is that as defenders, as cybersecurity professionals, we operate with timelines. We operate under quarterly deliverables and end-of-year planning. Unfortunately, that mindset is not a great mindset to apply to attackers, because attackers don't have deadlines, right? They can execute an operation and lay dormant for over a year, and nobody's going to yell at them and come to them and say, well, where are your end of quarterly deliverables, right? They don't need to deal in that situation. So time for them is a vastly different component than we specifically think about. And I think that's important because we often try to think of these attacks in very small increments or very rapid kind of succession. And here we're seeing that this was a very long, prolonged campaign with a lot of patience behind it, and obviously a lot of talent and resources. So from here, so my intention here was just to kind of give you an illustration of how this happened. Keep in mind that we had a supply chain attack. These vendors were attacked. They were used as pivot points to get into the intended targets, and we'll see more about how that actually occurred. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through this kind of attack chain and take you step by step from how reconnaissance and intelligence gathering was done, how they weaponized their targets, what happened around delivery. And so basically we're going to go through each one of these modules, and kind of with each one, I'll also give you kind of things that probably could be done to help minimize this risk in your own organization. And then we'll kind of go from there and open it to questions. So stage one in this attack was to gather intelligence. Now, there was an extremely heavy reliance on open source intelligence. Now, one thing I will tell you is that as a company, when we perform pen testing, one of the things that differentiates us is we do a lot of open source intelligence gathering. And so I would behoove you, whoever you're going to use to do pen testing, to make sure they're doing this, because it's a very powerful technique. And I'll show you why it's very powerful in a few seconds. But there was a large reliance here on open source intelligence, the way they selected their targets, the way they found who the vendor partners were. These were things that they just simply got off press releases. They were able to get them off of just websites that mentioned who they did business with. And you really need to think about that in this day and age. Those type of things really work against you. I know it's just par course of the business and everybody wants a press release and wants to get their word out, but it's working against you when you think of this from an attacker's perspective. One of the things that we often look at when we're doing pen tests, and I'm sure these attackers did as well, is what are your job postings? You know, it's one thing to say that you need a systems analyst or a network engineer, and they should have 3 to 5 years experience. It's another thing to say that you need a network engineer with 3 to 5 years experience running Cisco 4.x5. Because now you've told me exactly what's in your environment. And if you're running Cisco 4.x5 or whatever you're running, I can go search for that vulnerability without ever touching your network, and I know that that exists. So again, the intelligence gathering here was extremely powerful and led to very rich return on investment for these attackers, because they were able to figure out who exactly does business with who, and then go after those specific vendors to use those as pivots to get into the intended target. Now, what I did is when we were going through and doing our own research, we decided to see, well, how easily could we find things if we were to go after the supply chain, if we were after critical infrastructure. So we basically did 3 Bing searches. We just typed in searches into Bing to look for companies that support critical infrastructure. And we didn't use any kind of exploit. We did nothing illegal. We used no fancy tools. This is not something that, you know, by any means is considered advanced. But I wanted to do this in this threat briefing because I think it's quite important for you to understand how the supply chain becomes a very large threat to any organization across critical infrastructure, whether you're a hospital or a water treatment facility. And so what I'm going to show you is what we found in this research. And so we're kind of replicating what the attackers did. So what we did is we basically, on our 3rd Bing search, we did 3 searches in Bing. We didn't even use Google. We were able to find a consulting firm that specializes in water treatment plant planning and construction. So these are the people that build water treatment plants. They do the construction behind water treatment. They're a partner to a lot of water treatment facilities. And we're not going to mention who they are. I don't think these guys have done anything wrong. They're just not aware of the fact that they're probably going to be used as a target. And they just had their site was misconfigured. So what you see here on the left-hand side of the screen was we didn't do anything. We didn't exploit anything. We simply were able to find that their site allowed for something called directory traversal, which basically gave us a dump of every image on their site and every document. Now, this is not something that we did to hack them. This is basically their site's misconfigured, and anybody can go there and just basically type in the URL, and you're going to get this information. So it's a simple site misconfiguration, right? Many of us on the phone probably have this situation and don't know it, but it's a big issue when it's your partner. It's an even bigger issue when you have an organization such as somebody out of Russia who starts using this to develop an intelligence profile on targets. And the way that intelligence profile gets built is that this organization had pictures of a new water treatment facility that they were bringing online. And so these are pictures, they're very proud of them, that say, hey, look, here's what we're building. And this is actually on their website. Now, between getting this off of their website and actually doing the directory traversal, we were able to blow up, if you look over here, this screenshot, we were actually able to blow that screenshot up and get a nice schematic of the actual water treatment facility. So the reason I'm pointing this out, and we've kind of redacted some information like the login ID and some other things, is that we start having a real good picture of what this treatment plant is running. And the important thing to keep in mind here is this is exactly what the Russian attackers did when they spotted these vendors in the supply chain. And for many of us on this phone, managing the supply chain is a really daunting thing, but it's now becoming a real serious critical threat when our partners, without really knowing that they're becoming the vector, are leaking information that can be used against us. And so it's real important, and this is why I'm saying you can't just think that this is a technical partner. It could be anybody that's doing business with your organization. So it's a real daunting footprint. But what was more important was that when we did browse their website, we came to this section called projects. And we clicked on this link here thinking we were going to get a list of the types of projects that they work on, maybe a brochure or something of that nature. But this website was actually misconfigured. And before I show you what actually came up when we clicked on that, you can notice down here that these are other partners that they support, right? So if we're looking for targets that run Mitsubishi Electric or Schneider Electric or wherever it may be, this is actually a real easy way for us to figure out, is this the type of vector that we want to use? Again, we haven't run any fancy tools, and that's a real important takeaway here. All we're doing is using information that's readily available to develop attack profiles. So when we did click on this, again, we expected it to be a brochure or a list of projects. We didn't target these guys. We just were binging and Googling to find them. And when we clicked on it, this is what we got: a PDF of a schematic of a water treatment facility. There was no mention of any projects or any types of projects. It was just this information leakage. And again, I don't think these guys did this on purpose. I think there was just somebody misconfigured or put something on their website that shouldn't have been out there. Whether this has any value at all to an attacker, I don't know. But the reason that we illustrated this, and I wanted to illustrate this in this first stage of this attack, is to give you a taste for what the Russian attackers did, probably for several weeks, figuring out who they were going to go after, and then stepping back, figuring out who their partners were, and targeting those partners, and gaining intelligence on them. Now, what can you do about this? Well, there's a few things that you can do based on just this step. You really need to think about auditing information leakage. You need to think about what's going into your job postings, your press releases. What information are you providing to those people that mean to do you harm? You need to institute policies against any kind of computer screenshot in public-facing documentation. You really don't need schematics or pictures of your user screens or your medical devices or your plant operations or your wiring diagrams or your HVAC systems to be part of any kind of forward-facing documentation. I know marketing loves that, but you should probably have a conversation with marketing and show them this threat intelligence briefing. You really need to think about requiring all partners, regardless of what sector you're in, to maintain the same security controls as you do. If you have a responsibility to maintain a certain level of security and safeguard certain operations, systems, or people, or data, then you need to require that of your partners. And that may be difficult for smaller partners, but you really need to think about that your partners now, again, have become a major vector. And so the other thing you can do is at least ask your partners to produce risk assessments and pen testing results to make sure that they're running risk assessments and they're running penetration tests against their infrastructure and external facing systems. Simple things to do, nothing groundbreaking here. But now let's move into the second stage of this attack, which was weaponization. What happened here? Now this is where it kind of gets kind of cool for those of us that are kind of geeks and into the technical stuff. These attackers, again, did not exploit vulnerabilities. They simply used a technology that is used every day to make systems run. So the way to think about this is if you turn off any of the things I tell you in the next couple of slides, you will probably break how your computers work. So the scary part is if you turn it off, you can disable how your workers are able to communicate and interact. If you don't turn it off, there's a good chance that this can now be used against you from an attack perspective. The thing to keep in mind is this is not a simple thing to fix. This isn't something that companies can come out with a patch and suddenly it's all going to be fixed. These are really hard technical issues to solve because they're not vulnerabilities, they're workflows. And what we're doing is exploiting the workflow, a valid workflow. So what happened? Well, these guys send phishing emails, nothing big there. But this phishing email basically had a link in it that exploited what's called the SMB protocol. For those of you that aren't technical, I got you covered. I'm going to walk you through this in a moment. For those that are technical, you probably understand exactly what I'm talking about here. There was a reference to an IP address and this thing called normal dot dot. Now, normal dot dot is a template. If you have Microsoft Word, or there's Office 365 or something else, it opens, when you open a blank Word document or you say File, New Document, it opens what's known as normal dot dot, which is a Word template. Now that Word template can be anywhere in the world. It could be on your local machine, it could be on a file server, or it could be on a server somewhere else in the world. So the way this works, the way it's worked forever, again, it's not a vulnerability, is that I can tell it to either look on my C drive for normal dot dot under my documents folder, or I can give it an IP address. Well, when I give it an IP address, it means it can be any IP address. And obviously that IP address can be anywhere in the world. So what happens is when you click on that link, Microsoft Office sends your credentials because it's saying, hey, is this user allowed to open that normal dot dot document? So again, this is just normal functionality. There's no vulnerability here. There's no virus, no Trojan, no malware. I'm just using a standard technical feature that's part of pretty much every computer. And it's not even a Microsoft Word thing. This is a basic protocol known as SMB that allows different types of computers to communicate and share information. So I'll get to that in a little more depth in a moment. The second thing was these watering hole domains. And these are basically these domains that the easiest way to think about them is either they're fake domains or legitimate websites, fake websites that look real or legitimate websites that our users go to every day. If I'm in healthcare, it might be the HIMSS website. If I'm in the industrial control sector, it might be a website on the latest industrial controls or best practices. It could even be an industry website that talks about cybersecurity and privacy. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. The attackers then compromised that site, and that's what occurred here. These guys went out and they compromised industry websites. And when they did that, they altered the website content so that, again, they had links. They're not truly malicious, but they were malicious once executed, links that allowed them that when you have your users going out to these industry websites, they were then compromised. So starting to hopefully paint a picture that these are operations that people are doing every day, and it's very difficult to kind of stop them from doing. It's basically if you had to go and say, hey, nobody in my company is allowed to now use these industry websites. It would be a difficult thing for you to do. They also, when they modified these websites, they changed some of the JavaScripts and PHP files to request a certain icon, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But right now, I want to take another look at this normal dot dot and how this works, because I think this is really important. So here, let's pretend this is our server. We're the attackers, all of us on this phone. And we now have, we've broken into one of our supply chain vendors, one of our partners, right? So pick any partner you want. We've broken into them, whether they're a technical partner or a service partner, it doesn't matter. We broke into them, we've taken over their Microsoft or their email system. It doesn't matter if it's Exchange or whatever it may be. We've broken into our partner system, we've taken over their email system, and we now send the target, whoever it is that we want, an email. And that email comes from us, and it's a legitimate email. It's not any kind of, adjacent domain. It's a legitimate email coming from our partner. And, you know, it's a valid user, it's a valid domain address, so we're not going to blacklist it. You know, we've given them authority to talk to us. We don't, you know, put them through any kind of scrutiny because they're our partner. We validated their domain. And in it, I just put this little link that says, hey, how do we protect your data? Now, I made this up just for the purposes of this threat intelligence briefing, but most people, I bet, in your organization will click on that to figure out, yeah, what is going on with my data? How do you guys go after my data? What do you do with my data? And so if I click on that, what happens is I tell it to open up a Word document, even if it's not attached. This is just a link. And at that moment, that is going to go to some server across the world, which is our server. Now, when that occurs, what happens is Word will send your user ID and password to this server. Why? Because Word is assuming that I need to understand if this user that just clicked on my link is allowed to actually open that document. So it's a very standard, very legitimate operation, right? You want people to be able to check their credentials to make sure they're allowed to open that document before it gets open. Well, using that infrastructure, using a legitimate operation, what happens is, as an attacker, I collect the user ID and the hash for the password. I reject the opening of the document. Your user basically gets told, oh, sorry, invalid URL. But they've already sent me their user ID and password. This isn't the user typing in the user ID and password. This is all done behind the scenes. Once I've collected that user ID and the password hash, I can then just, again, I don't have a time limit. I can then try to crack that password using a variety of different cracking tools. It's a very ingenious way to do this, right? Because I'm forcing the technology to work on my behalf as the attacker. And frankly, as a defender, there's not very much you can do about this. There's a few things you can do, but not a lot. So one thing here is security awareness training. Right? You need to make sure your users understand, is it really worth interacting with that industry site? Do they have to visit every magazine site, every blog that is related to their industry? Now, obviously, the answer to that's going to vary, and there's not much you could probably do about it. But it is a very serious vector at this point. Remember, we have hundreds of victims that fell victim to this attack. One thing you can do is create a policy and try to enforce it as best you can, that if anybody's using an external website, an non-corporate website, that they should use a different user ID and password. Many times, and we find this a lot during pen testing and actually during intelligence gathering, we will find that corporate users will use the same user ID and password they use for their corporate accounts on an external industry website. And so it's real important that you tell them, like, look, if you're going to create an account on another website that's not owned by this company or this organization, use a different user ID and password. So at least if that gets compromised, they don't have the user ID and password for your organization. That would still not stop this little trick with Word that I just showed you on the previous slide, but hopefully it minimizes them being compromised by going through another site. The other thing is block access to non-corporate ID addresses for any kind of application template. It's a little harder to do, but something to consider. And that may or may not have helped in this situation. So delivery and exploitation. So we've now figured out, you know, how we're going to do our intelligence gathering. We've weaponized our attack mechanism. Now we have to actually deliver the attack, launch it, and actually exploit our targets, right? So we're now going to go from the vendor's world over into the actual intended target, the actual critical infrastructure organization. So the emails that were sent across, many of them had the links that I just showed you, but they also had, you know, very compelling subject lines, agreement and confidential. They had attached document.pdf to it, but there was nothing malicious in these. There was no Trojan, no malware, so it bypassed antivirus. There was no reason for antivirus to freak out or endpoint protection. The only thing it had was the link I showed you in the last couple of slides that when you clicked on it, sent your credentials across the world and gave up your credentials. The other thing they did was actually send something from one of these industry websites or to a partner website saying, hey, we've now enabled you to work on our website. We're going to share project management documentation. We're going to do file sharing, and we're going to set you up so that you can do this. And this is a very common practice today. And one of the problems is that many times when we do this, we've gotten users so used to single sign-on that when they go see a sign-on screen that looks like their corporate sign-on screen, they go ahead and enter the user ID and password, which is a problem. because basically it looks something like this, right? We see this kind of login screen. It looks like what we use to validate against Active Directory. Our partner has that screen, or the attackers put up a mock screen. The user's used to seeing it. They enter their user ID and password, and guess what? It's a fake screen, and now we have your user ID and password. Again, these are very low-tech, not very sophisticated attacks, but they work. So what can you do about these and this piece of the attack that was brought on? One thing we tell everybody is dual and multi-factor authentication. We hear a lot that this is not really convenient for users, but if you're not going to have it for users, then at least implement multi-factor and dual-factor authentication for all admin systems. I mean, that's something in this day and age that should just be kind of a foundational requirement. That if you have an admin level system, whether it's databases, third-party applications, your own systems, domain controllers, Active Directory servers, whatever it is, if it's critical to your operations, all admin accounts should have multi-factor authentication. Again, security awareness training, phishing simulations. One thing I will tell you, we hear a lot of organizations that do phishing simulation. Unfortunately, to be real blunt about it, I think we do the happy dance when, you know, the numbers aren't that good. So often we'll hear that, hey, we went out and when we did this phishing simulation, we had 80% of our organization click on a link. And after doing this a few times, we got it down to 10, 15, 20%. Well, if you have 1,000 people in your organization and you've gotten it down to 20% or 10%, that's 100 to 200 people that are going to click on a link. Probably not the best time to celebrate. Even if you have 10 people in your organization and you get 2 people to click on a link, that's 20%, it's still not a good thing. So you really got to start focusing on 0% when it comes to these phishing simulations. And I'm sure a lot of people are rolling their eyes and going, that's impractical. That's your decision. I'm just telling you from an attacker's perspective that as long as you have that 10 to 20% click-through, we're going to be successful. One of the things that we have found has been extremely helpful in minimizing your users from clicking on links and carrying out operations that ultimately defeat your defenses is actually attack education. If you take the information in these slides, and if you want the slides, I'm happy to provide them to you. Just send us an email. And then sit them down. Maybe you don't want to go to this level of depth that we're going into here, but just spending a lunch and learn and having it come from somebody who's an authoritative figure in your organization and saying, look, this is what we're seeing. This is the kind of stuff that we're seeing, that we're fighting against every day. You would be surprised how big a difference that makes. So please, attack education is a big thing that can help kind of minimize this risk. Not eliminate it, but certainly minimize it. One of the things that we've changed our policies here, honestly, based on this attack, is no longer allowing anybody to attach a resume to an email and send it to our HR and operations teams. We now require that anyone who wants to send us a resume either shows, we check them out on LinkedIn and require that their LinkedIn profile is up to date, or they have to paste their resume into an email with no links. And the reason for that is we're seeing a lot of attacks, especially this Russian attack, that use legitimate resumes attached to emails sent to the HR department to facilitate kind of that clicking on a Word document or clicking on a link and then creating that situation that I explained a few slides ago. Another thing is limit single sign-on. You want to keep single sign-on systems to your own corporation. If you have single sign-on with third parties, you're better off disabling that. And I know for a lot of people, that's a big grunt and a big challenge. But in this situation and what these attackers carried out, they relied on you using single sign-on. All right, so let's get into kind of what they did to persist themselves. So they've delivered the attack. They were able to get past your defenses using standard technology. So what did they do once they got in? How did they keep around? How did they stay in your systems for a year? Well, as soon as they were able to get to anybody's system, and get to that account. Obviously, they got the accounts because you gave them the user ID, your users gave them the user ID and password. They basically then logged on through a local account and then went ahead and created 4 different local user accounts. I'll show you how that was done in a moment. Basically, they ran a script. That script ran and created 4 different local user accounts that they then used to help escalate privileges and continue their attack in your system. Again, if you had multi-factor, those organizations that employed that, it thwarted these efforts because they didn't break multi-factor, they didn't break security, they just used the standards of technology. I know I keep saying that, but it's an important point to kind of keep taking home. They then created a Windows service task that ran every 8 hours. That every 8 hours would reinitialize anything that they needed, so that even if the user shut down the machine, or for some reason the process was killed, or some endpoint protection or something shut down the process, these guys had a way to kind of restart the process that they had installed. Anything they installed on the machine, any tools they loaded, they were able to restart quite easily using just local system accounts. So the script that they ran is this script called semantic_help.jsp. You can go search for it. If you find it, you should probably take a look at it, but it's been changed since then. And what this script did was basically manipulate the local environment where the machine was. So once they got on, whether it was sending your user to a industry website, an email, however they got the script on there, this script ran. And what you can see here is basically the contents of that script, right? Which is basically just a command that says, hey, get me the user directory contents. And once I have the user directory contents, because now I can figure out if there's any good files, any settings, any configuration data that would be interesting to me. And then go ahead and run this other script called nu.command. Now, when nu.command ran, it made a lot of changes to your environment. And so one of the things I found real interesting was these guys even localized this into 4 different languages. So they were able to do this in Spanish, Italian, German, French, and English. So again, good amount of resources worked on this. So when they did this, here's the script that actually ran. You'll see the first things they did was turn off the local firewall. They then added a series of registry entries. These basically enable remote desktop so that they could then RDP, remote desktop, into the machines. So they basically set that all up. They allowed concurrent sessions so that they could have multiple sessions running at one time, which is quite handy when you're an attacker and you have other users using the same machine. You could see that they added the terminal server configuration. So basically this thing runs in about 1/10 to 2/10 of a second. So this is not a long process. This is the second page of the script. And so you'll see that now we have the firewall off, which means, guess what? We can manipulate, the ports. We can do whatever we want. We've now added, and here are the different local administrator accounts that we created. And then you'll see down here at the very end, we start terminal services. And then obviously that task that I told you that runs every 8 hours makes sure that this stuff's all still there and that everything gets restarted in case for some reason it got shut down. So real simple script. Once they're in, they ran this, no big deal. So once this happened, the next step of this is they basically downloaded VPN software. Now, interestingly, this VPN software and some of the other things they downloaded, some of the password cracking tools, some other stuff they used, were all from public websites. And I can tell you when we've done pest testing, we've done this. We'll download things like PuTTY and Nmap and other things and never be stopped. So you really need to think about what you're doing in terms of allowing people to download whatever they want. It's a big issue. This was a free version of FortiClient, real good VPN tool, and it works really well. So they were able to establish VPN sessions back to their command and control, allowing them to run encrypted. So again, big takeaway here is things were taken from the publicly available locations. There was no super secret squirrel kind of servers out there that they needed to have running. In some cases, they installed Python. They were using Python scripts for some of the stuff that they were doing to help manage their persistence and traverse the network. Again, probably policies against deploying Python is a good thing. This is not, and I'm not belittling this, this isn't the easiest thing to stop from happening, but try to make it as hard as you can from a user. So once inside the target's network, they continue to download things. I'll talk more about this. I want to talk about this link file because this was kind of an interesting way to maintain persistence, and this takes us back to kind of the Stuxnet attacks of years and years ago. This is default Windows functionality. So I'm going to explain to you what happened here. Very similar to the word DOT, normal.dot tactic that I explained a little earlier. What happened here is all of us are probably familiar with these shortcuts on our desktop, right? This is a shortcut to Deezer, a music service that I use. Nothing special about it. I just copied this shortcut. Well, that shortcut in technical terms is actually called a .lnk file. And that has certain properties in it. One of those properties is this icon, right? So there's a Windows feature, and whether you're running Windows or a Linux UI desktop, these all work the same. So I'm not beating up Microsoft. It's just this is kind of how this one works. Well, what happens here is when you browse, when you bring up your browser and you're looking through your files, all of these little icons actually rely on this LNK file. So as you're traversing this network and all these little icons are appearing, they have to go get those icons from somewhere. And there's two places those icons can come from. The first is your local machine, if it's cached there. And the second is any IP address in the world. And so if that happens, it downloads that icon. Well, guess what? When that icon file is going to be loaded, there's an SMB request that's made. And that SMB request requires that you send your user ID and password across the world, wherever that IP address is, saying, hey, here's my user ID and password. Am I authorized to get that icon to display on my desktop or on my file folder? Which again is rather ingenious, because as soon as you do that, you've passed your user ID and credentials, user ID and password, even though it's hashed, to a third-party server and don't really know about it. So the attackers would create these little shortcuts on people's desktops. Now, most people don't notice why that's there, because all of us probably use some type of automated software deployment. So we've kind of taught our users that, hey, sometimes you're going to see new icons appear, and it just is what it is. And so they don't really question it, right? All of a sudden there's a new icon. Or the icon doesn't have to be fancy. It could just be something that says, this is a Word file, or this is a notepad.exe. Point is, attackers use it, and they use this built-in functionality to go ahead and get your credentials and privileges. So again, really interesting way to get credentials and privileges without having to really crack your system or break in or use any kind of really crazy vulnerability. So what can you do? Limit application executables. You know, one of the things here that we do see, if you can't stop people from downloading things, then create a corporate list of these are the only applications people are allowed to run in the environment, and lock those down. I know it's hard to do, especially when you have larger, complicated environments, but coming up with a corporate standard that says this is it, these are our 20, 30 different apps or 100 apps, is really important. And this is probably something that requires board level understanding, where your board needs to understand, look, life is changing, things are getting harder, we can keep investing in all kinds of tools, but ultimately it's kind of just standard housekeeping that's going to make the biggest difference. Non-critical websites, we've talked about blocking access, dual and multi-factor authentication, not allowing users to run PowerShell doesn't always help, but it's a good first step. And disabling local admin access is a good idea if you haven't done that. So at this point, these guys have established persistence. They're able to stay in the system. You can reboot. You can do a bunch of things. They're there. Oh, by the way, one of the reasons that shortcut link was put on the desktop was the law of large numbers. If any of you have an insurance background, you know that basically the law of large numbers says that if you get any population of people, a certain amount of people are going to fall victim to some type of calamity. So this desktop icon that they put there because they knew that someone in your organization was going to go, what's this? And click on it. And as soon as they did, that launched the whole restarting of the attack and sending the credentials. So, you know, it's kind of analogous to putting an icon on your desktop that says, click me, and thinking about how many users in your environment would actually do that. Probably a lot of them. So, you know, so I'm going to kind of jump past this command and control because I want to talk a little more about actions on objective, because I think this is kind of important in terms of what happened here. So once they were able to get into the systems, the next step, and this is really important, you know, once they got into the actual systems, they now have persistence. They're inside the intended targets network. They're inside that critical infrastructure organization, your hospital, your nuclear power plant, whatever it may be. The first step they did was reconnaissance the network, right? So Department of Homeland Security observed that the very first step, once they're in there and they've gotten themselves squared away on how do they maintain their foothold, that persistence level, the next step is to start browsing file servers, start looking across the network and figuring out what's out here and where do we want to go. Because ultimately what these guys really wanted to do was get to that critical infrastructure system. They wanted to get to the power plants, guts, right? They wanted to get to the actual water treatment facilities, pumps. They wanted to get to the medical devices. They want to get to those things that are critical. And so what they do is they basically scan the network. They start seeing what else is out there, and they continue to move through it to eventually finding what's called a jump machine, because a lot of these critical infrastructure organizations have segregated networks. Unfortunately, they'll have a jump machine. And so they'll get to that jump machine, which allows kind of a bridge into that segregated network. And they then are able to get into that segregated network and go from there. So these are files here. These .text files are all basically the outputs of the scripts that they ran on the network. So it gave them a very rich inventory of what they were able to see and actually kind of look at. They then began to archive this data and then ship it out of the system, zipped it up, and got it off of the network. So if you look, you'll see a directory out structure created in the file repositories where they put everything, made it all nice and tidy, and then were able to exfiltrate their data. So one of the other things they did is they took this IP.txt file and a few others. They were able to catalog all the IP addresses. So the thing, I guess, that's, if anything, is challenging here is these are real basic kind of tactics, right? Running reconnaissance, sniffing the wire, determining what IP addresses are talking on the network. There's nothing nefarious here. This is all just standard stuff. The fact that they could execute these operations is not, from my perspective, mind-boggling. It's actually scary because it's very hard to defend against these things. They didn't do anything to really trip a lot of the systems that many of us rely upon to protect our infrastructure. So here's the output of one of the files. You can see they ran some command files. They would just iterate through that IP text or one of the other text resource files, and they would just create a catalog of the username, the session, how long they were idle, blah, blah, blah. And then they would ship that out once they zipped it, and they can do further analysis on it later on, which is probably the scarier piece because they now have a inventory and a fingerprint of the environment. So they were, basically the big thing they were looking for was any kind of ICS or SCADA data, wiring diagrams, panel layouts, anything of that nature across the network, as well as trying to access those systems themselves and see how far they could get. They were really good at cleanup and cover. So once they got all the information they needed and they were able to grab all of that rich data, they deleted any accounts that were in there. They created an extra account. They deleted everything out of the registries. They removed all of their scripts. They deleted all the subdirectories and files and folders that they created. So they left everything real nice and tidy, and they exited the organization. And it really was a matter of very deep forensics to understand if you were impacted by this or not. What can you do? I will tell you, and I'm going to be very transparent about this, we as a company have a honeypot product. But whether you buy them from us or you buy them from someone else, and obviously we'd love for you to buy them from us, you need to start thinking about honeypots. The whole concept here that these guys got onto a network and were able to just kind of traverse the network and do reconnaissance and stay in a network for, in some cases, up to 18 months should have never occurred. And it's not a slam on anybody that was a victim of this. So it's not blaming the victim. It's just, if I would blame anybody, it's the industry itself. We've got tools that can be used, but we're not using them. And we've kind of now seeing that attackers have found yet another way to kind of use our own infrastructure against us. So the important part here is to use the infrastructure, their own tactics against them. So if they're going to go do recon as one of the first things they do once they establish their persistence, then we should have tools that allow us to detect that reconnaissance rather easily. And we can talk more about that at some other point. So what are the key lessons learned? I kind of just hit on this. This is the attacker's methodology. This is the methodologies that are used by attackers. We use this when we're doing pen testing. Your greatest opportunity to kind of stop somebody is right here, right? This is when that reconnaissance is started. So this here is the intelligence gathering, the vulnerability assessment, gaining persistence, and then they're in, and then they're going to move forward. In terms of detecting this attack, to figure out if you're a victim of it, there are different rules that you can download and run on your environment to see if there's any signatures matching the attack. But honestly, one of the biggest things you're going to have to do if you feel that you truly are a victim of this or have reason or suspicion to do that is some form of deep forensics. What I would tell you is if you do believe you're a victim of this, contact Department of Homeland Security or your local FBI office. Speak with them. They've got a tremendous amount of resources to help you figure out if you've fallen victim to this, and they have kind of a whole bag of tricks to figure that out. So you don't really need a third-party consulting firm, although you can elect to do that. But it takes quite some skill to figure out if you've been attacked, because they've been very good at cleaning up after themselves. Excuse me. So what about active defense? Some just high-level things that hopefully came out of this conversation you can take away. You definitely have to understand your vendors. They are now a critical target for compromise. The one thing we've learned in historically from attacks that have been carried out is that they repeat themselves. So now that we're seeing that partners are becoming a more interesting vector, we will see those attacks continue to evolve. And unfortunately, for many reasons, most of our partners can't afford to put in place the security that a larger organization has. So we really need to think about how can you help your partners get secure and maintain that security. Regardless of category, I want to drive that home. Do not just think of, oh, well, they're our IT partner, but our janitorial supply company doesn't matter. Because frankly, I can tell you as an attacker, I'd probably go after the janitorial supply company if I want to break into your organization before I ever go after that IT organization. You have to have a last line of defense, right? You have to have something that when everything else fails, when everything else breaks down, you have that ability to detect the attack. Honeypots are a great way to do that, or other types of low-tech breach detection tools. Network segmentation is extremely critical, but if you're going to have network segmentation, and there's really no way getting around it, whether it's a long-term or short-term project for you, you're going to need to get there from a defense capability. But if you're going to do that, consider zero trust networks and consider how you're going to lock down those jump machines, that machine that allows you to access that segmented network. How are you going to lock that down? Because obviously that becomes a pivot point. This concept of high value targets is an extremely important part. This is really about thinking about where attackers really want to get to and what do they want to get after, and how you can create a ring of defense against those things, right? You can put all kinds of endpoint protection and other things in place, but you really need to think about is, okay, if this is what they really want from me, how do I completely lock that down and harden it? And what can I do to kind of make sure that doesn't, no matter what, that doesn't get compromised? User education we've touched on. This is really, really important. Talking to them about the types of attacks that you guys are up against now, more than just, kind of making them aware of things, but truly getting them to understand they're a vital component in your defense. And then this architecture for defense, I didn't really go into it a lot here, but we are starting to see that architecture can hamper overall security defensiveness. For example, many of you have fault-tolerant systems in place, and so when an attack spreads, one of the things to keep in mind is that it's not uncommon for that attack to spread simply because your systems automatically fail over. So if I compromise, let's say, your A segment, your half of your infrastructure, and I take it down, I bring it down, and it automatically fails over to your B segment or your secondary backup systems, that attack will continue onto your backup systems, and before you know it, your entire organization is compromised. You really need to have a conversation with your C-suite, your board of directors, all your interested parties to rethink fault tolerance. We've seen a lot of high-velocity, violent attacks which end up relying on that exact, automated failover to occur because of disaster recovery. And we did a lot of people championed 4 nines, 5 nines availability in the late 90s and into the 2000s. Today, with the types of attacks we're seeing, this is probably something you want to rethink and wonder if a manual failover may not be a a better way to go. Again, it's up to your business, but something to consider. So that's pretty much everything we have on this level on these attacks and what occurred. I'm happy to go into deeper, take questions. If you have questions, if you bring up the participant window, I know it's hard to see here, there's going to be a little hand that you can say, raise your hand. And if you do that, I should be able to recognize you and unmute you and give you a chance to ask a question. So with that, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Those are the contact details for myself and Jerry from Comply Assistant. So if you'd like to ask for the slides, if there's questions you have on anything, feel free to reach out to us. But with that, I will check to see if we have any questions and kind of go from there. So not seeing any questions. Give it another minute or so. All right. So we will actually have this as a recording, which you'll be getting a notification of from us. It'll be up on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access that there. But I do appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. And again, if questions come up later on that you think of, or if you want the slides or anything of that nature, please let us know. Hopefully this was valuable. And you found it to be something that you can use in your day-to-day operations. So with that, thank you all very much. Bye-bye.